So I only have one big question, which is what I've been starting with. And,
Oh boy.
As things, I mean, it's not a big question, so to speak, but I just have kind of been seeing where things go after I ask this question. But are there any moments that stick out as moments of radical change for you? And if you want me to go over kind of what radical change is,
yes,
I can do that. So Irwin defines radical change as this moment, or this process almost, in which all of our foundational thoughts on life and who we are slowly start to be questioned, so we can't ignore those questions, and eventually we kind of have to realign our worldview. And sometimes it happens in an instant, like there are definitely big moments that cause that kind of change, but I think he also does a really good job pointing out how it can be a slow process. And also that we live with change all the time. It is a constant thing. We tend to want to ignore it,
yes,
which is part of the reason why we have radical change, because we ignore the small changes that happen until we can no longer ignore them. So if you want, you can talk about something that is not at all related to your art making. If you want to talk about something related to your art making.
I think I might have some things to say or answer, but let me ask something else before.
Okay.
So why do you think it's relevant to ask an artist? And we're assuming I'm an artist here.
Because I think that people who create are really attuned to process. And you know, I have a background in dance, and so I feel like in terms of my process as someone who moves, I've gone through these moments of radical change that have affected me, artistically speaking, but also it has affected my life outside of that. And so I feel that, well, first of all, I have a great resource here with a lot of artists around me, but I also think that artists, again, spend a lot of time thinking about why they're doing what they're doing, and very few artists are constant and consistent over the entirety of their lives.
Yeah. Actually, I think you probably, I think you're right, but I think among students, art studio students, well, let me put it in my, I remember thinking when I would talk with my fellow students about artists, how little change would happen in a career. And that's probably not true. My big hero is still Duchamp. I think he changed constantly. But you look at other artists, and we mostly look at big artists, whatever that means, and there is change, and we can see it because we take their whole life and we compress it in like an hour lecture, and there you have it. But really, if you like look at it, there's a lot of seeing what works and then trying to milk it as long as you can, and that's the not nice way of saying it. You could also say, you know, then you hone your craft and really. Okay, but I want to. So let me go back to your question, like about radical change and how that influenced your work. I mean, I think it influenced your personal life, but that's for everybody, right?
Right.
I'm an artist, so I make work, so maybe it's more relevant to talk about that. I think the radical change, or the changes that I see through my work, actually is looking back, like an art historian would. And so in third grade, I broke my arm. I couldn't go to PE. I ended up all by myself in the classroom, and I started to draw. That's radical change number one. Like, but that's all back. That's all looking back, right?
Right.
That is breaking my arm was radical, and not being able to be with the group doing your physical activity was quite radical. I felt like that too because I love moving, and so then looking back, I realized that's when I started to draw, like consciously, as a thing that I enjoy doing, that I, for myself, decided I was good at. And so there are moments like that. And that mostly seem to be, if I look back at it, before I started college. But that's because I think that's the time of your life when anything that happens has the most impact. if I look like, at the last 10 years, there's definitely radical changes, but I'm less clear about how that influenced my work. I had one last fall when we were in Cortona. I was with the Cortona program, and when I say we, my family came too. Oh, okay. And we ended up in the studio together, and we made a piece together. It was a fully collaborative piece. I hope that is a radical change. If I will look back in another 10 years and see what happened. It felt like a radical change because it was completely different to my approach, where normally I'm a control freak and I manipulate every square millimeter. And that's partly because it's mechanics, it's electronics, it either works or it doesn't.
Right.
But now I had an 8-year-old son who kept spitting ideas at me, and some he could do and some I needed to help him with, and then he ended up making such a beautiful thing that I had to convince him to collaborate with me on, which he wasn't necessarily willing to do because he thought, as I thought when I was 10, that his piece was, the best of anything ever. So he wouldn't give that up. But yeah, so those are probably not the radical changes you're talking about when you look at significant visual or artists in history that might deal with bigger issues in the world in life, when war happens, when social shifts happen. I mean, people are there and they respond, and so do artists. So the difference is that they will leave a visual artifact to look at it afterwards. So, I use this example in my class a lot. The futurists, were very socially engaged with the whole modern time speeding things up. And then World War I happened, and there was a big collision between what happened actually and their manifesto and their ideas. I mean, there are some radical things happening there. I don't feel I fit in something like that, but that's not for me to do. That's for you to do.
Well, I mean, what I've found in the few interviews that I've done thus far, that a lot of people don't, like, as art makers, it's usually these small, slow changes that are very reflective. And the example that Robert Irwin gives is this slow process of being a painter, an abstract expressionist, and finding that for some reason, he'd been painting because that was what he was taught to do, and over time he was like, why am I painting? And it was a slow process, and eventually it just led to this moment where he
so let me ask
moved away from painting entirely.
Like, this is what I've been questioning a lot for myself. I wonder if that's important to know. I mean, I think it's interesting to know, but I think, I make the shit, and then when it's done and I put it out there, I don't think it's important for anybody else to know if that was a change for me or even what my ideas were about it. Can I make a very stupid comparison?
Sure.
Do you know anything about soccer?
About what?
Soccer, playing.
Soccer, I mean, a tiny bit.
Well, that's the only sport I know a little bit about.
It's okay. I know more about football soccer than I do about football. I don't understand.
Oh, okay. Yeah. See, I don't understand football too. So that's the only reason why I can make that comparison. But it's. I think there are more parallels between sports and art than, and not as the product that it delivers or the effect that it necessarily has, but the way that it's treated. And when a soccer player is really good, with art we tend to ask the artist, like, so what is it about? Where did it come from? And when a soccer player scores a beautiful goal, we don't question where that came from. At least that's not the first response. The first response is that it's awesomely magnificent. and we can be completely stunned by the quality and the craft and the commitment that's all given to get to that. And I think there's actually something similar that happens or should be considered when we look at art. I mean, the first thing that you do is when you see something visual is if it's visually engaging, if it is a beautiful goal, if it's, and maybe later those questions are relevant, and maybe it's not even that they're later relevant, they are relevant, but I'm not necessarily sure if we should ask the artist those questions. I think radical change that shows in art, especially put in a historical context, is more interesting, or at least starts from a distance, from a viewer's point of view. The critic writing about it, which is, is some distance, and historian writing about it. And then maybe later on, it's interesting to hear what the artist has to say about it. But especially when you go to an artist lecture, whatever the artist says, it's considered the truth because he or she made it, which is not true, not at all. I mean, it might be the truth for that person if we consider the artist just another person considering the work. But I think the artist's role is to be like the soccer player making that beautiful goal. It's his commitment, it's craft, it's, being really, really freaking good about it. And whatever that means. I mean, that's not just being able to handle your tools right, but it probably also means being aware of the time that you're in. A soccer player from 30 years ago has a completely way of playing and was considered completely different in its beauty than what we consider good now. Although there, of course, are some similarities because you still have to score that goal. And I think you still, somehow, I don't know really what that means, but somehow you still have to score that goal when you're making art too. So for myself, it's really funny to think of, I have these moments, I don't know if they're radical changes, but I have these moments that seem to be significant. But they actually mostly relate to my commitment to making art than they are necessarily about the change in the work that I did. And when you were talking about small changes, I'm going from here to there, I'm going everywhere, okay. I'm sorry. When you talk about these small changes that artists have, and I really should talk about myself, but I have a feeling this actually applies to more people. I don't think we artists necessarily consider them small. I think quite often we consider them pretty freaking big. It's like this aha moment that you look at your work and all of a sudden you realize I shouldn't paint, or it needs to be all black, or whatever it is. When you ask, maybe it's being told as a small change, but I think quite often in the studio it's this life-changing experience, at least in that short moment that it happened. Because it's like a revelation. It's like this. It's like, why didn't I think of that before? Or what the heck? Like, I mean, it really is. It's this and it feels like the world just shift completely. And then later on, it most likely will end up being just a small change, if change at all. Like quite often you also look back and you're like, yeah, that makes complete sense because before that happened and that happened, and then it just ends up being a logical line in which things took place. So I think there's a huge difference in the moment in which something happens and the timeline looking back on it, where you put all these things in context of that timeline, but also in context of what happens in your own life, what happens in the community around you, what happens in the world. Anyway, something like that.
No, it seems. I mean, there are again little trends that I'm picking up on. But there are these moments that people have, and I feel like that's part of this thing with radical change, though, in like paradigm shifts, they talk about these moments where you're like, oh my goodness, what's happening in my world? And then you get used to it. And then you look back and you're like, why was that such a big deal to me at the time? Yeah. It's always, and sometimes that's, I mean, it's not always the case, but I think we've learned to cope with change too, in a way that as long as it's not like an earth-shattering kind of change, we can kind of recognize it if it's big enough, and then process it and put it aside, and you know, kind of deal with it in a different way.
It is funny and it's contradicting. I mean, in some ways we live in change. I mean, just the fact that time just keeps moving, that's just change. I mean, we can sit here for an hour, but every second that we sit here, it will just, by definition of its physics, whatever, it is change. We don't, you know, I've learned that we don't see without change and we don't hear without change. I mean, if our vision is constantly saying the same thing, our eyes actually start moving automatically, because otherwise we don't register.
Right.
And it's the same with hearing. If there's no change in what we hear, we don't hear. It's the changes that we hear, it's the changes that we see. But yeah, then again, we also don't, the changes can be too big or too radical, because then we start going into mechanisms that will either deny the fact that something changed, or we come up with other excuses or stuff like that. Yeah.
Well,
That's interesting.
Everyone starts this with the sentence that change is the most basic condition physics of our universe.
Yeah.
And I mean, when I read that, I was like, he's so right.
Yeah. But then the other thing, yesterday I was listening to a documentary, and they were talking about, because there is new proof that the Big Bang actually happened. And so together with the discovery of the Higgs particle, those are two big things.
Right.
But there was a scientist that said, okay, that's all fine and good that we find these proofs, but these are theories that have been like 30, 40, 50 years old at least. So we're finding now proofs of theories that were done, you know, half a century ago. Where are the theories of today? Oh, I forgot my point. I was going to make a point with that. Oh, yes. So in that context, there was a scientist. So there were 3 scientists coming up with some things that they would like to see a theory of. And, you know, there were a couple of things like, we have like, I think 4 major forces: gravity, magnetic, small and large forces. And he was saying, we think that there might be one way of describing all those 4 forces. There is no theory for that. So that was his thing. Then and this is my point, then one of the others was like, you know, we partly have religion because we want to understand why it is that this stuff is. And so what he wants to see is, do we question why we are here because we are here? Because if we were not here, we wouldn't question it.
Right.
Or is there actually a formula that will show that it was inevitable to happen? Because so what we have now is all these numbers, like the amount of atoms, that the force that it takes for an electron to spin around the nucleus, and these have all numbers like dials, and they're very specific. You move it just a little bit and the whole thing will floop disappear. So I thought that wasn't it, like, I forgot what my point was, but the fact that he was like, the fact that we are here, can we explain that? Or the fact that we are here, is that why we are wondering why we are here? Or something like that. So how did that relate to change? I forgot, but it does.
Physics, change, essential, something along those lines. Let me see if there's...
So you've asked more, so you're asking several...
I'm finding that it's really just that one big question that I'm asking.
But you're asking that of several people.
Yes, my goal is to find 10 to 15 different people. This is my 3rd one, and I've got 3 more that are going on the schedule today.
So who else are you asking?
I talked to Patrick Bryant. I talked to Ben Britton. I will be talking to Joe Camusa.
Do I know who that is?
He's a painting and drawing MFA.
Okay.
Michael Benedetti, who is a printmaker. Courtney McCracken, who's in sculpture, and all of the MFAs right now that I'm talking to are in my class, but I really want to go talk to Ryan McCullough because I've talked to him about his changes in his work a little bit, and I want to talk to Mark. And so I'm taking suggestions from my classmates and people that I talk to for other names.
So are you going outside the building too?
Right now,
I mean, like, are you going outside the realm of visual art?
right now I'm kind of sticking with
Okay.
visual art just to keep it related a little bit to the class. And we're talking about interviews this week, actually, so it's funny that I'm starting this project this week. But I wanted to take the artist writing class and apply some of the things that we talked about to artists, more or less. And again, it comes from an interest in just getting to know more about the people that are here.
I think that's a good excuse
Yeah,
to do that. Yeah.
it's a really great
Yeah.
excuse because we've talked about that with some of the MFAs, the art historians, about how
It is. It's a shame.
we
I
should
mean,
use the resources that we have in
Yeah.
one another.
I mean, Isabel Wallace is basically the crossover.
Yes, she's one of my advisors.
Yeah. And, you know, I think a lot of studio people relate to her because she relates more directly to what we're doing because
Right.
she is the contemporary art historian, which seems to be, what's the word for that? Like an impossible you know.
Oh, to be a contemporary
Yeah,
artist. Oh,
yeah.
we talk about that all the time.
Yeah.
Like it's a constant. It seems to be a constant like existential crisis. For
I mean,
people.
she probably has way better ways of. Like, I always wonder, why is she not considered a critic? I mean, if you put an art historical context on something contemporary, aren't you being a critic?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if that's
don't
true.
know.
But
I mean-
see, this is why I'm not an intellectual, I'm not a theory person, I just make shit. And that's my role. And then when my shit is out there, other people should decide if it has changed or if it's good or whatever. Anyway, cool.
Well, thank you so much.
So what will be the end product of this?
Right now, I'm taking a page out of Leo Lozano's book and doing a lot of documentation in terms of like just time stamping things and seeing how requests get responded to. I'm kind of going the opposite, where she just does these like lists of like, I had a conversation with this person. It was interesting.
Gotcha.
And it happened on this day. I'm going almost the opposite because that's how my brain works. And you know, when she did that, it kind of was like, well, what'd you talk about? So I have my notes that I'm taking, and I'm going to try and record as many as I can. And so I'm thinking right now the best way to go about it would be to do some kind of like a WordPress site that, you know, I can share with the class and share with the people who have been involved in the project. And collect it that way. But I don't really know. I'm not a very technologically savvy person.
That's why you go ask other people to do
Yeah.
it. So will your take on it be like your understanding what you get out of these conversations, or are you more kind of posting whatever these people tell you?
Part of it is what I get out of the conversations, for sure. I'm definitely interested in seeing. I'm curious about the trends that come out because after only a few, again, like I've said already, there are certain small things that are almost, they're not consistent, but they're very similar. And so, yeah, part of it's my interest in that and just seeing how each conversation goes for me and for the other person. I'm trying to take notes about my response after I talk to the person, you know, each person. I'm still, a part of it is just the process and seeing how things develop over the course of asking this question. And so I think part of the end result will just be seeing what happened. It's kind of an experiment
It would
for
be,
me.
I mean, it sounds interesting to me to see what kind of line you can draw through all of it. Like what is similar. Because we probably are, I mean, of course, we're all unique in our own ways. But I think we're way much part of a time that we want to believe we are.
Right.
Especially if you're a romantic artist that thinks he or she is unique in, you know,
Well, I'm not trying to make this into any kind of grand psychology project, but
Well,
it's more of just a human response interest. We've talked about the human condition a lot in class, and so what is it like? What is the human artist condition? This is a little bit part of the question.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that makes it interesting. I think that makes it also useful for what artists then produce. Like, things can be beautiful in their own way, but they're always part of a time frame too. I mean, I know the Mona Lisa is considered beautiful by a lot of people that don't know squat about it. Probably the majority thinks it's beautiful because they're told you're supposed to think it's beautiful. But I think it's even more interesting when you see it in the time frame. And I think, when you start digging a little deeper into it, that's how you consider it. And not so much like the layers of paint that were actually applied and how they were applied. Especially with him, I always feel like, anyway. Okay, I'll shut up now. What time is it?
It is 10:02.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Is that, do you want more? Do you need more from me?
No,
Okay.
I think that's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.